Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us for part two of our discussion with Resha Conroy. Just a little housekeeping to get us started. I'm joined by my colleagues at Carroll, Osa Osage, who's the Director of Culture, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and Amy Dempster, our Director of Communications and Marketing, as well as our former colleague, but now head of school at Learning Prep, Dr. Kurt Mollering, head of school at Learning Prep. Um, just framing the context a little bit for our discussion with Resha tonight. Black students have historically experienced both over-identification in certain disability categories and under-identification in dyslexia, creating this very complicated and often mistrusted evaluation and intervention landscape. This session with Resha offers us practical strategies for supporting Black and historically underserved students, responsibly addressing disproportionality, and importantly, building authentic, protective partnerships with families. Our speaker this evening, and we are thrilled she said yes to come back to part two, is Resha Conroy. She's the founder and executive director of the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children, a nonprofit dedicated to eliminating inequities for Black students with unaddressed learning disabilities. Resha is a speech and language pathologist and the mother of two with learning disabilities. And she brings over a decade of leadership experience in education and nonprofit management. Resha also serves as the New York State Dyslexia and Dysgraphia Task Force, as a member of that task force, and on the National Center on Improving Literacy Advisory Board, where she champions educational equity at the intersection of language, literacy, and culture. Please join me in welcoming Resha. Welcome back, Resha.
Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you. And one thing, so sorry, Resha, I didn't get through my housekeeping before I did all that, which is Resha expects to present for about 35, 40 minutes, and then there are 20 minutes for questions. If you could, please use the Q&A feature. We have disabled the chat just to protect anonymity. Our intention is to address all of these questions at the end of this presentation. Anything we don't get to, we plan to sort of circle back with folks on email. So again, thank you for joining us. We appreciate you spending your time with us on this important topic. Resha.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here this evening and to do a deep dive into moving from mistrust to protective partnerships. And I'll talk a little bit about how I came to have that as the focus, which some of it is based upon what happened during part one of this presentation. And so we'll call this part two, and who knows, maybe there'll be a part three, but part one was done about a year ago. And there were a lot of questions that came up. So tonight we're going to really dive into this intersection of dyslexia and systemic issues that are faced by Black students, and not just by Black students, but by their families. So some of the questions that came up last time were around skepticism that Black families may have when they are getting or facing a dyslexia diagnosis, or there's a suggestion that they have their child evaluated. And there was some conversation that came up around this idea of it being like a double stigma. So adding another label on top of the student being Black, which is obviously a social identity that is not often celebrated or affirmed in schools. So over the past, and I'll say that actually that is a very common question that comes up in our conversations with educators. So there wasn't anything specifically unique about that question, and that's the reason why we wanted to address it. So over the past several years, our work at the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children, and you'll hear me call it DABC for short, has centered around two things. So the first is our work with educators, and we've worked with educators really across the country with the focus of not just raising awareness about dyslexia, but also about this intersection of racism and ableism for Black students who have dyslexia and what that looks like for them. The fact that they are invisible, the fact that they are either diagnosed very late or they're not diagnosed at all. And so we brought a lot of awareness in that area. The second part of it, which I always say is about 80% of our work, give or take, is the work that we do with families. And so we have a lot of one-on-one conversations with families through our parent coaching. We provide different levels of support. So everything from helping a family through an advocacy issue to connecting them with a resource in their community where their child can get intervention or tutoring. We also do our own training. So we have a structured literacy training and we have some advocacy training. And in both of those areas, we've seen real progress. So families are learning, we have lots of workshops and learning happening, and educators are learning. They're learning about dyslexia, they're learning about the science of reading, they're learning a bit about this intersection and having more conversations about it. But within the system, families and educators still seem to be very disconnected. And so this is where we found ourselves, especially over the last year. So the question essentially that came up is when families decline in evaluation, or the question I'm asking, and I know chat is not enabled, so I just want you to think about it. But when families decline in evaluation, what do you typically think? Right? So you're in the school building and you're working with the student and you're seeing that the student is struggling. Maybe you've done some tier 2 intervention and the student is not making progress. And then you approach the family and they say no. So a lot of things might come up, a lot of reasons might come up, and we'll explore some of those in a bit. But what we started to do was to ask different questions. So we said if families are essential to student success, and we know they are because we have over 50 years of evidence that tells us that if families are involved and engaged and partnering, that student outcomes are better, then why do our systems struggle to fully partner with them, especially when the stakes are highest? And when I say the stakes are highest, I mean for those students who are typically and historically underserved in our traditional settings. And then the second question that we asked is, what if one of the most misunderstood barriers in the literacy system is actually one of the strongest protective forces we have, meaning this family partnership? This question emerged from the types of conversations that were happening because whether a family decides to get an evaluation or not is really not so much about the evaluation. It's information that's telling us how the family is interacting with the school system. And I'm going to use school system more frequently than I use teachers because individual teachers bring different things to the classroom, but the system is pretty consistent in terms of its outcomes. So I want to introduce you to a group of women, and you may or may not recognize some of their faces, but all of them are mothers of children with dyslexia. And they all began their journeys advocating for their own children. Through that advocacy, they extended their reach and they became forces that really moved cities, districts, states, and I would say even the country into transformative practices, right? So everything from opening the first district public school in New York City dedicated or committed to working with students with dyslexia and language-based reading disorders, to founding a charter school in Texas, to creating advocacy organizations, to really guiding conversations even around teacher education. And this story of all of these mothers is a story about what families can do when they are empowered, right? So reaching beyond their own child and extending into really transformational practices. And so what we see with the families that we work with every day is that when our families are empowered, they make better decisions and they're really able to act on behalf of their child in a way that goes beyond partnership. It moves into what we call protective partnership. And I'm going to explain a bit more what that means and why that's so important for children who have dyslexia and who have other social identities that have been historically underserved. So now let's think about our mindset. If we were to switch how we think about that reaction that a family has, right? So for us, when we hear a family say no, it looks and it feels like resistance. But what if it's not resistance, right? What if it's something else? What if it's actually protection? And so if a family saying no is actually protective, and we understand that, then we can start to tackle this issue more effectively, right? Instead of becoming defensive or instead of really feeding into the barriers that already exist and disconnecting the family from the school that we want to support the child. And so I want us to think about shifting how we think about families' responses and essentially family behavior. So moving from what looks like or feels like resistance, and of course that question is just one example. If you speak to educators and you speak to families, you'll see there's a lot of sort of pull and tug between families as their need to advocate increases. So not quite resistance, but it's actually a rational response, right? A rational response to a system that historically and even in present day is not doing a good job of serving students who are Black or Brown, who have a disability, who may be living below the poverty level. We can sort of layer on a lot of those social identities and see who's not being served well. And moving it towards a response that's actually protection, and a protection that is essential for that child if they want to have a successful academic experience and to preserve their identity as a learner, but also as an individual who's going to participate in society. So I often say that at DABC, we use a historical lens, and I think it's really important because if we move into a space of trying to come up with solutions and we don't understand how or why we are where we are, then our solutions are going to be incomplete, right? It doesn't recognize or honor the events, the history that came before. So let's take a look at the roots of what is essentially mistrust or this disconnect between families and our school systems. So why is resistance a rational response, right? Based on the data, both historical and current, resistance is a rational response to a system that has historically caused harm, right? So not just that we're not doing our job, but there's a history of actually causing harm to Black Americans and to students with disabilities, right? And so you overlap those two and it becomes magnified, that harm. We also have this historical roots of racism in education. So that's everything from anti-literacy laws. So we're talking about period of enslavement, all the way to current day practices or more recent practices around segregation, and not just segregation of bodies, but also segregation of resources, which I think was even more important. And then we had desegregation, which was supposed to be a good thing, but there was a negative impact as well, right? So we now had educational institutions that were no longer providing culturally affirming instruction. And we lost these sort of communities of protection and care that were very present in the lives of Black students prior to desegregation. We also had the loss, and this was one of the most significant losses of a professional class, but of Black educators who were no longer teaching in their local schools, but also would not necessarily be employed by integrated schools. And along with the loss of Black educators, we also lost a lot of the knowledge that they carried about what was working in serving Black students in the American school system. So segregation, desegregation, and then we come to the early 1970s, where a group of about 7 or 8 Black families had students with disabilities who were being excluded from the educational system. And they actually sued the Board of Education of the District of Columbia. And that lawsuit actually gave birth to what is IDEA today, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? And so that opened the door for what was supposed to be protections and inclusion for students who had disabilities. But as I often say, and if you were part of the first presentation, I talk about the caste system, it corrects itself, right? So now you have these protections in place, but now instead of it being something that includes, it was actually used, or special education was used to exclude Black students. So to remove them from the general education classroom, and initially really to put them in quite restricted spaces where they were kind of just forgotten. And although there's been a lot of work to improve that fear still exists. And we'll talk a little bit about the data, so whether or not these, it's working. So there's this disproportionate placement of Black students in these exclusionary categories or these really subjective behavioral categories. And then we have the current data. So what we see today around how Black students are doing when it comes to literacy instruction in the classroom. So in the state of Massachusetts, and I think many of you here this evening might be in the state, but there may be people from outside the state. And in fact, it almost doesn't matter because the results are pretty consistent from state to state, give or take about 3 to 4 percentage points, right? So we see the disparities in literacy outcomes, which lets us know that this isn't an individual problem. It's not an individual family problem. It's really a problem of the system, right? When we have these consistent disparities occurring across the country, this is an outcome that tells us that structural racism is very much still in place. So 20% of Black 8th graders are reading at or above the NAEP proficiency levels, as in comparison to 21% of Hispanic 8th graders, so still really low. And then it jumps up a little bit to 48% of white 8th graders. So again, we're not doing a great job with literacy overall, but there are certain groups that are definitely performing not as well on these measures. And these are the measures that we use. We can debate whether or not they're accurate or what they're really testing, but this is what we look at. And then 64% of Asian American 8th graders. So this kind of gives us a snapshot of what's happening by race and ethnicity. When we look at this again, and we're looking at the numbers by disability, so we have all 4th graders, and I think this is 2022. It's about 34% that are reading at or above NAEP reading proficiency levels. And then for students with disabilities, it's just about 9%. Right? So less than 10% of students, if you have a disability, are reading at or above NAEP proficiency levels. Yet we're telling parents or asking parents, go ahead and put your child into this group, right? What are we promising them? We're not promising them very much. And so the response that we get is one that, again, is a very rational response, and it's protecting their child from what is perceived and what actually is a system that is failing groups of students. So why would this trigger this sort of protective response, right? So if a child, so we looked at the numbers, right? So if a child is Black, we know that they are more likely than to not have proficient reading skills if they're within these traditional school settings. If a child has dyslexia, so now we're talking about disability, they're also likely not to be reading proficiently. And then when we overlap these two identities, and I don't have the numbers here, but now you're going to see numbers that drop well below even that 10%, right? Because now we're overlapping social identities that are interacting with the system in a way that is harmful. And there are many things feeding into this, and you can, take a quick glance at some of the things that are, but, the historical legacy, deficit thinking, linguistic racism, disciplinary policies, race science, so thinking about IQ testing, low expectations, racism, and specifically in this area, anti-Black racism, which brings within its own weight, especially in this country, intelligence and discrepancy models, ableism, and even this sort of gift of dyslexia that sounds really beautiful, and I think it's very affirming, and we definitely want to see the gifts in our children, but even framing it that way, we're not there yet. We're not there when we have students who are so underserved to begin to talk about it as a gift. Let's identify and let's find first so that every child has access to the intervention and the instruction that they need. And so this helps us to understand what a parent or a caregiver who has a Black child sitting in a classroom is thinking about. Even if they're not, pulling up a diagram like this, they know very well from the experiences of those around them what the pathway is for students who fit into these different identities. So this is something for us to think about when we're thinking about how a parent is responding to us. So we can shift our behavior and our mindset. And we're never sure which one is going to come first. Sometimes you have to adjust your behavior and practice that behavior, and then it begins to change your mindset. Or wonderful if your mindset changes and then you change your behavior. But as you're thinking about systems change, I say this because sometimes you just need to put things into place that is protective and then allow mindset to catch up. You still do that work, but you allow it to catch up. So we're thinking about moving from resistance to rational decisions that are being made based on what we're seeing, the truth of the system, into it being a response that is actually protective. And so I'm just going to pause and I want to define what protective factors are so that we're all on the same page with this. So protective factors are characteristics or conditions that reduce or buffer the effects of risk, stress, or trauma. So a lot of this comes out of cognitive and behavioral sciences and resilience science. And when we think about a protective factor, something like having a home, right? Even having a residence that you've been in for multiple years, having money is a protective factor. So a lot of things that are obvious as protective factors. Literacy is also a protective factor, right? And we've talked about it. There's not been a deep dive into understanding how much protection it offers, but there was an interesting study that was done out of the University of Minnesota that was really looking at resiliency factors. And they looked at a large group of young people, so children who were homeless or unhoused, and they followed them across their K-12 experience and beyond. And one thing that they discovered is that those students, even though they were homeless, even though they might have been living below the poverty level, if they were reading on grade level by first grade, they had better long-term outcomes. So there was something protective about literacy, and we know this. We sort of almost instinctively know this. So if there is difficulty with literacy or difficulty with reading, we know that a protective factor is actually being removed. And so parents and caregivers become more protective because they are the primary protectors of their children. You may find that, Black parents at times may be more protective because they also know that the identity of a Black student in the classroom is not a protective factor in many settings, right? And we can argue about whether or not this is true, but we can look at the numbers and know that there is a lot of truth to it. So as we move forward with this conversation, I want you to think about or to frame protective factors around this definition and understanding that literacy is a protective factor, and the loss or the challenges with literacy is going to raise alarms for families. And this could go across other academic areas as well. So how do we move into building solutions? So I'm going to walk you through really three main areas today in terms of how, as an organization, we are moving forward with going deeper into this work with educators and also with families. This evening is going to focus more on the work that we are moving forward with educators, but I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do with families as well towards the end. So we have historical practices of success, and we're going to talk about what those are because we're not starting from scratch. We have evidence and we have history of things that have worked and things that have worked specifically within Black communities that can be translated and moved into any community. We have evidence-based practice, and we're going to talk a bit more about what that is because we talk a lot about evidence-based when we're talking about goals and about instruction. And I want to make sure that we understand what that is and sometimes why what you think should be working is not working. And then we're going to touch on resiliency science. Okay. There are two other things in here that you probably cannot see very well because I'm not going to really cover them so much tonight, but identity protection through narratives. And that's some work that we're going to do a deeper dive in with families, but certainly educators can work with families to do this as well. And then building parallel systems of support, right? And so when systems are failing, sometimes we have to move outside of those systems. And I would argue and say that, this evening, the Carroll School is one of those sort of parallel systems of support, right? Our specialized private schools are in learning prep, have built these sort of parallel systems of support. And sometimes we need that, especially for our students who are slowly responding or our students who are really being impacted by the emotional and mental health weight. They just need to be in these very protective environments. And I tell parents that sometimes as well, because it's just a fact, it's the truth. If your child is 3 or more grade levels behind, it's really hard to find a traditional school setting that's going to get that student up to grade level. Not impossible, but it becomes more difficult. So let's start off around the first one, right? This sort of historical model of what it looks like for families and educators and communities to navigate what is very often a hostile educational system, and it may be just a hostile world that they're dealing with, right? So I want to introduce to you the Black teaching pedagogy, and it is a centuries of work that's happened within the Black community around literacy and around education that we can look at as a model of success, because in fact it has been very successful. And these practices inform a lot of DAPC's models for family partnership. When we look at the Black educational experience, one thing we know is that Black Americans have had to fight for pretty much every educational right that they have. And it's one of the reasons why I use the example of Mills versus the Board of Education in DC, right? Every step has really had to be fought for. And so there's a lot of history around how to sort of navigate systems that are not working for you, while also protecting the students who are being served. And so what we now call family partnerships was once collective advocacy rooted in protection, expectation, and community accountability. And that really is at the heart of the Black teaching tradition. In the Black educational community, we saw academic gains, right? So prior to desegregation, we have wonderful and beautiful stories of innovation that allowed Black students and Black adults to have access to literacy, whether it was the floating schools, the floating freedom schools that were floated out along the Mississippi River outside of the jurisdiction of the states to provide literacy. Or if it was the Black literary societies that really focused on literacy and found ways to teach in churches and in other community spaces and embrace literacy in those spaces. And we have to look back to that in order to build solutions for what we're facing today, because they are stories of success. So Dr. Lesane, who is someone that if you want to learn more about the Black teaching tradition, that I recommend that you Google, and you can you see some of her publications and some of her lectures around this work. But she's codifying the Black teaching tradition, really looking across the history and figuring out what are the principles that exist. And a lot of this work happened in the South, but things like high expectations for students, cultivating the spirit of the mind, professional expertise. And then the last two at the bottom that I really want to focus on this evening, this idea of an intertwined destiny. And what that means is that if I'm the teacher, if I'm the educator, and I'm working with a student or with a classroom, their success is my success, right? Their failure is my failure. And it's not just about us in the classroom, it's about the community, right? So education in the Black teaching tradition was about making sure that every student had access, because it was going to improve the conditions of the community. And that type of intertwined destiny is really at the root of building trust and relationships with families. And then there was also this deep partnership with families, right? A lot of the educators came from the community, so they knew the families, they knew the grandparents, they knew the aunts, they may have even been the teacher of one of the parents. And this connection with families and this trust with families, so that families were really part of educational conversations. And they were also held accountable, right? So, you can go and knock on so-and-so's door and say, oh, I haven't seen this child, or they need to do this, or they did that. There was some accountability there as well. I want to give just a few resources, because there are many things that are not covered within our School of Education. We know that teaching reading is one of them, but we don't rely on traditions, educational traditions across cultures, right? And so if you want to learn more about this, I have a couple of books that you could get started with. So Fugitive Pedagogy and The Lost Education of Horace Tate. And then I would also direct you to the Center for Black Educator Development, which is really working on the Black education pipeline. And a lot of their work is rooted in the Black teaching tradition. So we use this as foundational to our work and work that really can be used in any community because it is about connecting, it is about building partnerships with families. So the second thing that I want to talk about in terms of building solutions is evidence-based practices. So historical evidence tells us that it works, right? Connecting with families. And now we have research that also tells us that families are critical, they're a critical component of evidence-based practice. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what evidence-based practice is, which is something that really came out of the medical model, and it's been used across other disciplines as well. So education, speech language pathology, which is really how I was introduced to it, but across many settings, social work. And what it means is that we have really three main components, right? So we have our evidence, right? So this is the research. So in the literacy space, we would think about this, it's the science of reading, and that's a growing interdisciplinary model. And so or disciplines, and we continue to learn there, right? We continue to uncover and discover more about how we learn to read, and also instructional practices and intervention. And then you have your educator or clinical experience. And so this means your own training as an educator, right? You can have all the best research, but if you don't know how to implement it, how to translate it into the classroom, it doesn't mean anything. And so you want to have educators that are well-trained. And it can be the educator, but also you want to have a community of educators that are well-trained. So you want to have coaches and mentors who you can turn to ask questions, and you continue to build your expertise by doing that. And then the third component is student or family perspectives and values. These three circles are equal in size. One is not greater than the other, but if one is missing, then you no longer have evidence-based practice. And so a lot of times when we're saying, well, we have the research, we train the teachers, we're still not seeing progress. Come back and take a look at what's happening with this third circle, right? How have you included families as true partners, or maybe even as protectors in this space? And one of the reasons why, so I don't want to blame the schools of education for everything, but they have to carry some of the weight for this, is that our educators were not prepared to partner with families. And so in 2020, there was a study done, a national survey of colleges and universities around educator training, and they found that only 51% of educator programs had one standalone course in family and community engagement. And only about 31% of department heads really believed that family engagement was essential. And so we have not made it a priority, and we're seeing those outcomes. We're seeing those outcomes even more so in communities where families have to rise up to the level of not just being partners, but also being protectors. And so this is an important and critical area for us to address. We have almost 50 years of research that tells us that this is important. In addition to, historical evidence dating back from 1970s, which was really about compliance, to 1990 to 2000, where we started to see some frameworks being developed. 2000 to 2010, we started linking family involvement to achievement and seeing that, if families are more involved, right, then student achievement improves. And more recently, we have the work of Dr. Karen Mapp around the dual capacity building framework for family partnerships, which is really a great foundation in terms of how to think about building family partnerships. And then we have Learning Heroes that's really begun to do some nice research on what this means, what family partnerships look like, and what's working and what's not working. And so those are some resources that I would definitely direct you towards. Learning Heroes just did a recent study around COVID. And COVID was really a time that showed us that family partnerships matter because students were learning from home. And so you could start to see the cracks in the system. And so schools that had really strong partnerships prior to COVID, those students did better during the times where we were doing remote learning or hybrid learning than those schools where they did not have that. So we've talked about the history of family partnerships in the Black teaching tradition. We've talked about the importance of evidence-based practice and that third component, which is families, that has to be included. And the third area that I want to cover this evening is around cumulative risk and resilience model of dyslexia. Now, this is research that came about in around 2022, or it was published in 2022, based on the work of Katz and Petzscher. And it looked at reading outcomes as being shaped by multiple factors, right? So language development, cognitive processes, instruction, and environmental supports, right? And these environmental supports included families. This model looked specifically at dyslexia, which I think is interesting and really important when we think about the heightened need for protective factors and resilience. And so you can, this is an open resource, and so you can actually Google this and do a deeper dive into it. But there are risk factors, and they have them here. So, things like phonological deficits and resilience factors. So instruction, and then at the bottom here, you can see family and peer support. What we know from this is that instruction alone does not determine outcomes, right? So this kind of brings us back to the evidence-based three components, right? Some students succeed despite having a lot of risk factors, and some students struggle despite having support. So the difference, the idea or the theory is that the difference is in these protective factors. In the study, there were a few things that I just want to, call out around ways to think about and the ways that we thought about what was missing in terms of transforming or changing the system and building in more parent partnership and protective partnership. So parent management training reduces negative outcomes in children at risk, and that doesn't come out of the dyslexia world. It really comes out of more behavioral world. Effective parenting promotes positive outcomes for children with the greatest impact on those most at risk, right? So again, you're seeing that that our students with dyslexia who are struggling, who are more at risk, that parenting, positive parenting matters more. Nurturing relationships and strong family cohesion act as protective mechanisms. Strong parent-teacher partnerships positively influence literacy development, especially for at-risk students. And I'm using risk and at-risk. It's not my favorite term, but I think it's, it's important here for us to sort of distinguish as we talk about protective factors and we think about risk factors. So how we've thought about this and what we have developed and what we're introducing, and then I'll talk about how we're piloting it, is the system called Align. And it's designed to strengthen literacy outcomes through aligned systems and family partnerships. So we're going all in around family partnerships because we don't think this can happen without them. We know it can happen with them. It works beautifully. We transform systems. Without them, we have these negative outcomes. So we're building across those three things that I talked about. And in fact, what we're doing in building this is that we're not doing something new. What we're doing is we're aligning systems with what families and communities have always done and what research confirms. And so we're moving from compliance, right? So just you're attending a meeting, you're signing a document, engagement, where you're attending events, maybe you're volunteering. And so schools really hold a lot of authority and decision-making here still, to partnership. So this is getting us to Karen Mapp's framework, where we're sharing communication, you're collaborating, and there's some shared influence. We argue that for our students who are most at risk, who have dyslexia, we have to move to protective partnership, right? It has to be deeper than that because our systems are not designed to make them successful. And so we have to equip families to and build their capacity to be protective partners for our students. And this is a deeper dive into understanding student data, navigating response to intervention and multi-tiered systems of support in special education, and being able to advocate, which is a scary word in many spaces, but be able to advocate effectively for services. In that, so how we're framing this idea of protective partnerships is family protective literacy praxis. right? So we're introducing and defining this language around how families actively support, interpret, and advocate for their children's literacy development, and it could be other academic areas, by drawing on cultural knowledge, their lived experiences, and adaptive practices within and beyond school systems. So in doing this work, it is an emerging systems level model that is, that we're building based on the evidence and building based upon lived experience. So I'm going to kind of revisit our original question with just kind of a quick wrap up, and then we'll have time for questions. But we want families to act as the primary protectors. We want to build a family's capacity to be protective. We want family input. It's a critical component. And families give us data, right? They give us data not just about how their child is doing, but their behavior also gives us data that is a reflection of maybe what our system is doing. So the question, and I've expanded it just a bit, is that a teacher suspects that a student is struggling with reading. Maybe the student has gotten some support already at tier 2 and tier 3, and they suggest that the student gets an evaluation, and the teacher declines the evaluation, right? Now we're thinking that this hesitancy is not about them resisting, it's giving us information about the system, and in fact, the parent knows that they have to increase their need to protect their child. So instead of just saying or thinking the parent's not agreeing or they're not working with you or not partnering with you, ask yourself about what that data point is telling you, right? It's telling you that something has been missed along the way, that this parent needs to move into protective mode. And there are many reasons why. You have a deeper conversation with the parent, but also audit your system. It could be a lack of clarity about the process. It could be mistrust based on past experiences. Could be concerns about labeling or identity, which, like I said, are real concerns. There might be a misalignment between what the school is seeing and what the family is experiencing. And that's an actually really important one to understand, because you can get really good information about what the child can do if you understand what the family sees. Or there can be doubts that instruction will be effective. And again, that's a reasonable response given what we see about reading proficiency for students who have disabilities. But when we begin to adjust how we see the response and really figure out where it's coming from, and it may be coming from multiple places, we can then have a response that adjusts the system. And so, here are some examples, and I'll do the last two on the list. So if there's sort of this data mismatch, then you invite the family to go deeper around this. Maybe the child is reading more at home. Maybe the parent is giving them some supports at home that you're not aware of. Maybe they don't think it's an issue because there's a parent who also struggled with reading, and maybe they figured out a way to be okay. That also gives you good information if there was a parent that was struggling with reading, right? So do that deeper dive. Instructional doubt will give clarity about, if we're going to evaluate your child, what's the support they're going to get? And do you have evidence that it works in your school building, right? That's a really important one. If I'm going to take this risk when I feel this need to protect, that the school can affirmatively tell me that, we've had success in the past with this program. So you get a behavior, the family hesitates, treat it as data. What's it telling us? Adjust the system, not the family, and use it to improve the decision-making process and to improve the system. So I'm going to leave you with a question as you think about the behaviors that you see from families. And I want you to ask yourself if we have, and even you within your district, depending on how much influence and power you have, or within your school, have you built systems that are worthy of trust? Right? And I want us to really think about families as assets, right? Essential, right? The co-architects of education, as protectors, as knowledge holders. We can't do this work without families. It's not evidence-based if families are not included. And so this next step for us is to think about systems change, because we know, thinking back to those mothers who transformed not just the lives of their children, but transformed systems, the power that families have. I will give you a quick, we have some time for questions and answers, but I do want to invite you to our upcoming virtual conference. You can get information about it online. And then the Align program, we're going to be piloting it. So if you're interested in learning more about it or interested in participating in the pilot of this, you can also reach out to us to learn about participating in this. And that will happen in June. So you can email us or go to this link, which I'll share after as well, to learn more information about it. So we're right at 7:46. I had to make sure that I got everything in, but we do have times for questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Risha, thank you so much. We do have some questions in the chat. Osa and I are going to kind of deliver those. But I'll start kind of with a question that came up for me as you were speaking. As a leader of a school for students with learning challenges, learning disabilities, we think, in fact, we hosted some professionals today, and one of the messages that's really just kind of on repeat, one of the things that I always say when I'm talking to families and professionals is that it only works. We only work. Education only works when it's a partnership with families. And then, listening to your talk, you really helped me or problematized that word partnership. And I wonder, like, how I'm using the word partnership is enough, and that idea of protective partnership is really striking to me. And, are we doing enough? And what does partnership really mean? And I think a lot of times it means like we're open for conversations and we know it'll take time. And so we need to kind of build trust with our families. Many of our families come, just speaking from kind of learning prep and the Carroll School, families have to really advocate hard to get their students into these environments. And they sometimes don't come in with a lot of trust. And that's trust that we have to earn. And we say it through partnerships. But I wonder, if time is enough, if we have to be more actively pursuing, working to create a protective partnership. So I wondered, that wasn't a question yet. Here I go. Here's a question. How do school leaders work with families to build a better sort of partnership? Because I know at Carroll and I know at Learning Prep, we want to build partnership. But I think we have to do more. And I've just kind of like spiral. You hear me like thinking out loud here. But what are some practices where we can really build that protective partnership?
So that's a really good question. So around partnership, right? So I think the definition of partnership is probably one of the things that needs to first be explored. Like, what do you mean by partnership? Are we really talking about just engagement? Are we talking about, so the parent comes to an event, what types of conversations are happening with parents? Are those conversations just happening when something is wrong? Have you built like that sort of foundational relationship? Where are you? Where's your mindset? Do you see I talked about the Black teaching tradition. Do you see the destiny of that child intertwined with yours? That's authentic. If that's not there, a parent's going to feel it, right? Love is part of this work, right? It's not a word that we use a lot in this space, but if love is not present, if it's not there, if you don't have that intertwined destiny, this does not work, right? You're going to have these muted results even when you're doing your best. And so it's building that initial trust, which means that you understand the families, that you are giving them voice, that you're giving them voice when things are good, and that you're giving them support when things are challenging. It also means empowering them, right? So have you either within the school or outside of the school empowered families to be able to advocate and giving them the supports that they need to advocate? And it might be that that family needs the support of another family. They may also need models of success, right? So I don't believe you until you show me, right? I'm not going to take that chance with my child. So do you have models of success of partnerships with other families that you can share with your newer families who are going through this journey? those are really foundational to getting this work started. And then I would think about the investment that you're making in it. So we invest money in buying curriculum and programs, and we invest money in training teachers. What do you invest in your family component? If it's, what's left over, again, I'm going to tell you it's not going to work. So it takes a real commitment, but that commitment won't happen until we realize that that circle again is equal to those other two.
Thank you.
There was a question about the parent management training and a desire for more just elaboration around that. Could you share some more about that, please?
So parent management training comes out of the world of behavioral sort of disorders. And it was borrowed in Hugh Catt's building of the cumulative and resilience model, where parent management training looks at or works with students who have things like oppositional defiance disorder or other behavioral disorders, where the parent is trained to sort of reframe their interaction, their language with the child as they're experiencing these symptoms, and the way that it can be picked up and sort of applied, not one-to-one, but you want to apply some of those principles that are working, is the interactions that we have with students, right? Or that a parent has with their child, even around something as simple as you're doing homework. I'm stupid, I can't do this, right? How do you reframe that? What are the words that you give back to your child to affirm them, right? It could be something as simple as, and I'll draw my own experience. I have two children. My son has dyslexia. Both my children have learning differences, but my son is very severe dyslexia, and his sister is 2.5 years younger than him. And I saw that she was learning to read very quickly. And so I was really careful to never tell her, oh, you're so smart, you're reading, right? Because what message does that give my son? Because he's not reading. So I use different language. So it's really intentional about how we frame things and the responses that we have. And so, like I said, it's applied differently in the dyslexia space than if you're dealing with a more behavior, but we can help reduce, minimize those outcomes or those behaviors.
There's a question in the chat for students in a school like Learning Prep, where they've already been identified with the diagnosis, where they've had the testing done. What are some next steps for helping students and families build a positive relationship to that identity and that label? Would identifying and embracing with a label of disabled help with these relationships?
That is also another really good question. Some of it is going to depend on the student, right, and the family, and where you are in your journey. Ultimately, the goal is that the student, who's going to be an adult one day, has the tools to be able to advocate for themselves. And so, yes, there has to be some building an awareness of the challenges that they face. There's protection. There's obviously legal protection that comes along with having a learning disability. And so, in college, you have accommodations. In the workplace, you have accommodations. And so you do have to reframe it, because dyslexia does not go away. It is lifelong, and that the child is going to need accommodations. And so I would, start with positive language, right? That's a lot of the work that we do with parents. We're going to be launching a parent component to what I talked about, probably in the fall. And so I would invite families to join us for that. I'll definitely share the information. Mentorship, or models. So adults who have successfully navigated dyslexia, and not perfectly, because you want them to see the struggles in the story so that they can see the resilience in the stories. But we have a lot of individuals who have disclosed that they have dyslexia that you can look to. Occasionally, we do have individuals who will share their stories with us. We have a really nice one, a recording with Patara Jethi, who is severely dyslexic. She is an attorney. She took her bar exam as an oral exam, so across multiple days. So we do have these stories that we can even share. We have past board members that have dyslexia. So really, these models that you can give your child as well.
Okay, we're trying to squeeze in maybe one or two more questions. So what do you suggest that a family does in order to build protective partnership with a school when that child's in a setting where they're underserved and maybe the school is not necessarily responsive to this idea of protective partnership? Like what could happen?
Mm. So it is really hard to build a protective partnership with someone who's not participating, right? Because it's a partnership. It takes two parties to make it work. There are unfortunately situations, and I was in one where the school was so combative with me that there was no way that I could partner with them. That's a different conversation. It's an unfortunate conversation, but part of this work is that schools get on board with doing it, right? It takes two people to make a relationship work, right? This is a partnership, so it's going to take two parties to make it work. And some schools and some school districts have competing interests when it comes to identifying students with dyslexia. They may have limited resources when it comes to providing them with intervention, and they won't say those things at the table. They will instead be really resistant to your actions, and that is real, and it puts you in a place where I don't know if you can build a partnership. Um, for other things that might need to be explored.
I'll ask one more. You talked a little bit about the piece around school, like teacher prep, like certifications, not really giving teachers and educators like the language around this idea of partnership. So what can schools do when they're onboarding educators to be able to maybe fill in the gaps?
Mm-hmm. So, so look for resources, right? So I'll give you two, right? Karen Mapp has resources around training, around her framework, and visit us in a couple of months because we will have more resources for you as well around training specifically within the dyslexia space. So, like I said, moving from partnerships to this protective space, there's not been enough work done in this area. So a lot of this is going to be new. So we'll be doing a lot of this together.
Great. Thank you so much. For any questions that we didn't get to in the context of this conversation tonight, we promised to circle back on email. Risha, I wanted to say thank you so much. I know we all learned so much about the sort of current and historical perspective of Black students, the experience, this notion of familiar resistance, and now as we evolve to this intersection of literacy and intertwined destiny, and this terrific definition of partnership. Like I'm reformulating this in my mind and what this looks like. It's been tremendously helpful, even this small snippet. I have a strong suspicion we'll be back around begging you for part three. So thank you so much. This will be available recorded for anyone who didn't get a chance to see it tonight. Feel free to share it with your friends. And please look up DABC, Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children. OSA and I have attended some of their events. They're fabulous, and their training. So wonderful organization. Thank you for partnering with us, Risha. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Amy, Osa, and Kurt, so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.